But you know something that we don't have to wait to see what happens with that? You know, the events of this past Wednesday, hey, you know what, that's the obvious elephant in the room. That was a story that just, you know, despite the fact that I don't want this to be a political podcast, this is the story that just, it could not be ignored. I don't really need to tell anybody why that story can't be ignored, but of course the story was the unbelievable events that unfolded in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday. When basically just a crazed mob rushed the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. They were basically there at the behest of Donald Trump to protest. And I do think that he really meant to protest peacefully, even though he used the words show force in a tweet that he posted on twitter.com. I do believe that he intended for them to show up and protest peacefully, but a lot of them didn't. You know, most of them did. But that's not what at issue here. What is at issue here are those of them who didn't. And so I'm sure by now a lot of people are aware that Donald Trump was permanently suspended from Twitter today. You know, he's gone for good. At first they were going to slap a 12-hour suspension on him. And they eventually decided that that just wasn't enough. Now Donald Trump is banned. And in all honesty, I do think that that's there's an irony to that. As I know that there are a lot of people out there who are upset that Donald Trump was banned from Twitter. But in my opinion, I think that if Donald Trump, at the very least, didn't spend as much time on Twitter as he did, I think he might still be the president. I think he might still be the president after this upcoming inauguration. If it wasn't for the amount of time that he spent on Twitter, I think that he certainly would have been a better president. I think that there were times that Donald Trump, he literally confused just being on Twitter and saying things on Twitter for being the president. You know, the one thing that stands in mind for me was this past summer when there were so many American cities that were in flames, you know, from the riots that accompanied the protests of the Black Lives Matter protests. And, let's not get that confused. The protests were not riots. The riots were not the protests. The riots accompanied the protests. But the way that Donald Trump responded to that, in my opinion, was very weak. And I think that his weakest moment actually came on Twitter when he jumped on his Twitter and he tweeted the words "law and order!" ! So law and order, he tweets it. And it's like, well, buddy, hey, you're the president. You're the president. Don't tweet it. Don't just tweet it. Go get it done. Go and do it. And of course, he didn't do it, and so we wound up with a lot of what we saw over the summer. And a lot of what we saw over the summer was an absolute travesty. A travesty that accompanied a travesty. Because obviously in some of those cases where unarmed black men were shot, you know, obviously some of them were travesties. You know, some of them were not. I mean, the one in Kenosha, for example, was an entirely justified shooting. So was the one in Atlanta. I know a lot of people that have disagreed vehemently with that, but the simple fact of the matter is that, you know, if you're in an altercation with the police and you go for a weapon, if you go for a knife, or if you steal one of the cops' tasers and you turn around and you fire it at them, as far as I'm concerned, you just committed suicide. The cops are not obligated to stand there and allow somebody to come at them with a weapon. The cops are not obligated to stand there and be killed. It is that simple. There are a lot of people that have had difficulty with that concept. But that is what it is, and quite frankly, there is absolutely no room for negotiation on that. None. But you know, I've gotten a little bit off track there. So let's reel that back a little bit, and let's look at those riots, and let's look at some of those things that have happened. And once you look at those things, it becomes impossible to feed into this narrative that a lot of people are trying to spin about this thing that happened in Washington. You know, that this was a surprise. That this was something that came out of nowhere. Now, you know, let's make no bones about this. I don't think that anybody knew that was going to happen. But when you look at everything that's gone on over the past year, over 2020, especially in the summer, you know, when you have things going on like Minneapolis in flames, Atlanta in flames. Baltimore in flames. DC in flames. You know, when you have a bunch of lunatics in Seattle going and basically seizing entire city blocks of that city and being allowed to do it, and having the cops told to basically to retreat, get out of there, and to let them do it. To have that kind of political violence going on literally all year, and then to suddenly have more political violence in Washington, D.C., just because it's the other group of people that are doing it, doesn't make it novel. Just because the other people are doing it, it doesn't make it surprising. In all honesty, I do believe that this is what we are coming to expect. You know, the only difference is that apparently we had a higher standard for one group of people than we did for another group of people. Now, if I were trying to troll you right now, I would say that that's basically the anti-Trump people admitting that the Trump people are better than them. But of course, I don't really believe that, and neither do you. In fact, I'm sure that a lot of people who are going to watch this podcast really honestly believe that the Trump people are worse than them. And I don't believe that's true, and quite frankly, you shouldn't either. And there are people that I could think of, and I'm not going to name any names, but there are some people that I could think of, who I saw trying to justify these riots periodically over the summer. And quite frankly, if you actually stumped for political violence at certain points, and now suddenly you're opposed to what happened on Wednesday, now, I think that we can actually look at that and say to ourselves for certain that, in actuality, you don't oppose what happened in D.C. on Wednesday. You just oppose the people who were doing it. Now, I know that all sorts of people have all sorts of different ways to try to justify this to themselves, but the simple fact of the matter is that if you look at what was done on Wednesday as wrong, you have to admit that what was done over the summer so many times, you have to admit that that was also wrong. You know, because quite frankly, I mean, not only can two different groups of people doing the same thing at different times both be wrong, if the thing that they're doing is wrong, that is in fact the most likely scenario. That is the most probable scenario. You know, I don't really care who you are or what you believe. There is no political belief out there that makes somebody so special that they can just entitle themselves to do things like this. Or entitle themselves to basically write their check, their stamp of approval, you know, for that trail of destruction. Particularly if you yourself sit comfortable and safe, you know, in some gated community, literally thousands of kilometers away from where these people's homes and businesses are being destroyed. You know, and for those of you who might say that, a riot is the language of the unheard. You know, the simple fact of the matter was that by the time that those riots had happened, everybody had already heard. And pretty much everybody already agreed that things like, for example, the George Floyd murder, as I call it, because in my opinion it was, pretty much everybody had already agreed that things like that were wrong. So there was no need for a riot to make people believe that. Everybody already believed it. Everybody was already disgusted at the thing that they had seen. But you know, to say that something like that was about black people being killed by the police becomes absolutely, just astonishingly, just idiotic, for lack of any better phrase, when you consider a lot of what that was. And that a lot of that was, you know, homes owned by black people, business owned by black people being destroyed. And the simple fact of the matter is that, you know, people who start businesses, they have a lot of their hopes and ambitions, not just for themselves, but for their children, invested in those things. You know, these businesses are how they're going to pay to raise their families. The prosperity of that is supposed to extend into future generations, right? So this is how they fund all of their kids' activities. It's how they pay for their kids to eventually go to college or university. And so literally, when you go through a neighborhood like that and you burn down a black business, a black-owned business, you have literally destroyed no less than one full generation of black opportunity. And to say that it's okay for them to do that, because Black Lives Matter? You know, just take a step back. Take a step back. Take 5 minutes and seriously think about what you're saying. You know, here's the thing about violence, and this is as true of political violence as it is of any other kind of violence. And that is that violence always escalates. So there's a principle in political science that we refer to as the law of conservation of violence. And the way that it kind of breaks down basically amounts to this. This is how I'm going to shorten it. Is that in the absence of any kind of external intervention, the violence, it just escalates. It doesn't stop. Because when you have two people that are using violence as a political tool, neither one of them wants to be the one to call for it to stop. None of them really want to be the one to call for it to stop, because that's what makes you look weak. And so instead what we see are what you would call like an alternative to calling for a stop to the violence. And as we've seen with what happened here in D.C. this past week on Wednesday, actually we see a pretty good example of that, and it basically comes down to this. It comes down to two different sides, and almost the preponderance of voices on each side are not willing to own up to their role in it. So you've got two different sides of people that are largely telling each other, don't tell us to stop, you stop. And what makes the conflict in the United States so incredibly dangerous right now is that both of these sides are basically, they're fighting over control of the highest levels of power. So there is no higher level of power to turn to for an intervention. If you're somebody who voted for Joe Biden thinking that he was going to be the one to make that intervention, you need to stop thinking that right now. You honestly do. Regardless of whatever good-sounding things Joe Biden said on his speech on Wednesday, and I do have to admit that his speech sounded very good. But quite frankly, this was a speech that he delivered literally months too late. All of this other stuff went down, all of these riots, all of the killing of police and things like that. All of that went down while he was running for president, and he didn't give this speech while he was running for president. He's only giving it now. And quite frankly, all things considered, giving that speech late is worse than never giving it. Better late than never is not something that applies here. And quite frankly, Joe Biden can't stand back and pretend that his hands are clean of this. Multiple times during his run for the presidency, he said that he wanted to assault Donald Trump. And Donald Trump really wasn't all that much better, because when Biden came out and said this, it's like, well, Donald Trump basically just came out and said, oh, well, you know what, I'll whoop your ass. And Trump wasn't the only person that Biden threatened. Biden made all kinds of threatening remarks towards voters. But Biden never apologized for that, mostly because he wasn't pushed to apologize for that by anybody that he would listen to. And Donald Trump, he wasn't any better. The media are playing favorites in this in terms of their denunciation of the violence. They even went so far at one point as to refer to some left-wing riots as fiery but mostly peaceful. And a lot of these media figures cheered on Joe Biden when he was talking about assaulting Donald Trump. So quite frankly, the media is not any better. And so when nobody is any better, what happens? When nobody is any better, when nobody wants to look weak, one way or the other, the violence is going to continue. So what happened in Washington, D.C., that's no surprise. It's not really going to be any kind of surprise when it happens again. And unfortunately, under the current circumstances, it is eventually going to happen again. It's almost inevitable. And when it does happen again, you're going to have all kinds of people pretending like they're surprised, but really nobody can be surprised by this.